going to get started. I have one job as moderator, is to start and end on time, and then let all the folks here make sure that we don't throw chairs at each other or anything else. So it's a fairly easy job. I'm Jeff Selingo. Among the many hats I wear, I'm here as a special advisor to the president of Arizona State and a professor of practice at Arizona State University, where I run the Academy for Innovative Higher Education Leadership, which is a partnership between ASU and Georgetown. We have a great panel today with us to talk about a fun title, Change Agents or Kamikaze Pilots, Can We Have Unfettered Innovation in Higher Education? And quickly, just going down the line, and then we're going to start a conversation here and then open it up for some questions from the audience. We have Sean Gallagher, who's Executive Director of the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy at Northeastern University. Gordon Jones, on to his left. Gordon Jones, the founding dean, College of Innovation and Design at Boise State University. A good friend of mine from Ithaka, Kevin Guthrie, who's the president of Ithaka. We have Marni Baker-Stein, who's the Provost and Chief Academic Officer of Western Governors University. I feel like it's Western Governors Week for me. I moderated a panel at Gallup in DC with your president last week. And then finally, someone who will be receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award today is John Katzman, CEO of Noodle Education. So there's a word that is everywhere in this conference, which is innovation. And I think it's kind of a fuzzy word because I'm not quite sure people think they know what it means, but when we say innovation in higher education, I think we could come up with as many definitions as there are people in this room. So I want to ask each of you, and then we're going to really turn this into a conversation. What does innovation mean to you? But more important, given the title of this, what does unfettered innovation look like? Because higher education is a highly regulated industry in the U.S., and so that word unfettered, I think, makes some people nervous. So Gordon, we'll start with you, and then I'll mix it up a little bit.
Sure. I mean, to me, at one level, innovation certainly is about discovery. I think the reasons discovery, new, experimentation, but I think why there's often so many different definitions or ways in which people talk about it is often based on where you sit in your various role in your organization, who you are. I certainly here in universities, I oversee a college that is driving as a catalytic engine in a university innovation at both the model level and in some cases the academic sponsorship, new degrees, new certificates. But coming in, for example, I've had a faculty say, why do we need any innovation? We're innovative by definition. And the answer is you're right. Faculty are innovative. They are doing research. They are creating new knowledge. But often I believe this idea of innovation in higher ed is not looked at from the entity level, the institution level, at that level.
So it's looked at by the department level or the school level.
Yeah.
And say, we have innovative programs, we have innovative departments, but we may not be necessarily innovative.
But we're not thinking about where's heterogeneity, where are we thinking about our own distinctiveness as an entity? That's where I think it falls down.
Marni, Western Governors, of course, was kind of founded on innovation, a very different model, a very different cost model as well. What does unfettered innovation look like to you?
So just to comment on innovation, I think innovation is kind of an empty word in and of itself. It is a tool in the toolkit for getting to the most important thing. And the most important thing is serving every learner better and better all the time. And so in that context, there is no such thing as unfettered innovation. It's just a tool, it's just an approach. But when your target is serving the learner and only serving the learner, which is the moral imperative of our time, innovation can be an important lever that you can pull, but never unfettered. I can't think of any experience that I've ever had across my professional life or reading in the trade press all the incredible things that are going on, or working with companies who are trying to drive innovation at any level of the institution. There are always affordances and constraints. That's what makes innovation. How do we work within those affordances and constraints to drive change?
Kevin.
So I think I come at this from two perspectives. One, as an entrepreneur and someone who develops services from zero to something, which is one kind of innovation, and another observing the higher education community with some of Ithaca's services that are around consulting and research around higher ed. And you have to agree that there's no such thing as unfettered.
Right.
But those two different types of innovation sometimes get confused, right? That sometimes when you create a new enterprise, you have the opportunity to be very focused on a particular thing, and you pursue that aggressively, and innovation can happen in that context really fast, and you can have an impact in that context. So like when we started up JSTOR, that had that feeling, like you knew exactly what we were doing, and you could just go for that, and there was a freedom in that.
Which was seen as a very innovative thing when you started JSTOR.
It was, nobody had done anything like it, right? So it was completely new. Now JSTOR is 20 years old. Innovation at JSTOR is very different. I mean, fundamentally, it's about cultural change in a really fundamental way. And I think that, some people like John, they leave after that first part, and they go do something else.
That's why he's getting the lifetime achievement.
Yeah, that's why I'm still slogging away. Others of us stay and try to figure it out, and it's completely different. It's a completely different task. And in the context of your lives, in multi-mission-oriented places like universities and colleges, you really have to define what you're innovating about and for whom. Right. And that has to be very targeted in your assessment if you're asking, hey, are colleges and universities innovating? I mean, that's really an unfair question.
Sean, you're at a very innovative place at Northeastern. When I count the number of universities doing interesting and new things, you have a president who's really pressing on a lot of different fronts. How do you define this?
I think the interest and the reason it's become a buzzword, and I think you've written about this, Jeff, we have chief innovation officers now, and many institutions are doing turnkey innovation, where innovation to them is it's a new market, it's a new program, it's a new product, they partner with a vendor. There's innovation in the modes, right? Online, CBE, et cetera. Those are new ways. That's the root of the word innovation. They're new ways to access education. But the need is at the business model level to, I think, Gordon's point and where we sort of began, which is the traditional business model for higher ed, which I guess is what the fetters are, not just the regulations, but by design, right? These institutions, which are long-standing and have survived wars and plagues and whatever else over hundreds of years in many cases, are designed to be long-standing institutions. And you don't have the sort of innovative DNA necessarily. And I think that's starting to change in a market where enrollment is flat and there's more competition, et cetera. So I think it's really interesting to see innovation functions rise up within many institutions, or for institutions like ASU or Northeastern and others to sort of jump on the idea that we need to grow and change and try new things.
And John?
Well, first of all, universities do innovate. You look 10, 15 years ago, virtually no programs were online. Now 30% of graduate students are studying exclusively online. Like, this is a sector that is actually capable of innovation, but most of it, and what you think of as...
Do you feel like that was innovation, though, or they were forced to do that in many cases, right?
Well, there are a lot of motivations for innovation, but certainly the gallows, right? The shadow of the gallows is, focuses mind. But all of those innovations are what Christensen would call kind of sustaining innovations, and you would call fettered. Yeah. And it's really only completely new institutions that are looking for disruptive change. And the key to disruptive innovation is who are you disrupting, right? And having a clear target in your sights. But if you look at WGU, it could be innovative in a completely different way because it was starting from a clean sheet of paper, and there's a joy in that. But I think universities are not going to see unfettered anything.
Right. So, Kevin, you had mentioned an interesting word in your answer, culture. I get this question asked to me a lot around ASU, right? Is it strategy or culture? Combination of both, and what leads, right? So is this about, as we think about innovation at kind of existing institutions where you can't start like a WGU, Do you have to change the culture first, follow it with strategy? Is it strategy first and that leads to culture change?
So we did a case study of ASU about 3 years ago, and we went in and interviewed 50 people at various levels. And my short answer to the question is that it's primarily cultural. Strategy, the degree to which it's strategic is clarity of vision. So Michael Crow has expressed a clarity of vision, and it's taken, 13 years. The first 5 years, there wasn't a lot of movement. We forget that. I mean, he's been there a long time. And whether you agree or don't agree, or you applaud or don't applaud what's happening there, there's a consistency to it that has changed the culture. And by the time we got there, we did the interviews, we asked, what percentage of the faculty are on board with this overall story? And the story was very simple, right? It had 4 points to it, very simple, classic stay on message kind of approach. And when you talk to the faculty at that point, and it had been some number of years, what all the leadership said was 80% of the faculty are on board. The number kept coming up. 80% of the faculty are fully on board with what we're doing. And it's taken long enough that the people who are not are gone. Right. And the people who are still here are, even if they're the 20%, they're in the distinct minority, and they're going to go along with where it's going. So I think a clarity of vision followed by a cultural change in terms of people's desires and goals are really critical to innovation within an institutional context, particularly ones that are as big and complex as these.
Okay, so let's talk about the problems to be solved, right? This is what, 8, 9, 9th year or 8th year GSV? 9? So I remember I was here year 3, and I'm always amazed at how the themes have changed or evolved over the years. And we had Deb Quazzo on our podcast yesterday, and she was talking about now, we're talking about the blending of work and education. Very different than it was 7 or 8 years ago. We've talked a lot about data analytics over times and online in those very early years. So let's talk about the problems to be solved. And I want to ask each of you this question. What's the biggest issue facing higher education, the most pressing issue facing higher education that you think some innovative solution, even though it's an empty word, can be utilized to solve? Marni, let me start with you.
So I think as I said earlier, the imperative of our time is to focus all of education and higher education on the learner, on individual learners, and to make sure that we are serving this diverse landscape of learners that we do serve as best we can. And I think that there are many problems. There are structural problems, there are cultural problems, and there are leadership problems with higher education institutions being able to serve the student. There are lots of layers between that intention and any given student. But perhaps the biggest problem of all, if we strip away term and we strip away credit hour and we strip away a lot of the constraints about how we allocate faculty to the task of teaching, if we put all of that aside at the core, we don't understand in higher education how our inputs and our expenses drive the learner outputs. We can't see that easily. We continuously improve that, and we don't have a lot of levers or power to drive change once we get those insights. If we could see that, then a lot of other changes, I think, would follow out of the logic that exposes.
Sean, biggest
I
issue?
would say business model sustainability, and part of that is cost. So higher ed has been a human capital intensive sector, and I think the really key innovation, might surprise some folks, is an evolution of MOOCs and these hybrid degrees, and the fact that we now have degrees at places like Georgia Tech, University of Illinois, et cetera, that are using AI, and they're delivering at scale, and you can now get a master's for $20,000, $30,000 as an interim step between maybe the classic $60,000 master's or the free MOOC that has no instructor support, et cetera. So
But of course, that's at the graduate level. Do you have?
Yeah.
Is that just a precursor to it
I think
coming
we'll
to
see
the
that
undergraduate?
move to the undergraduate level as well, and that these experiences will be very much blended. And it's the same with things like, say, badging, right? You'll get a traditional degree, but it'll have these digital elements to it, and you'll study online a bit, and you'll also study face-to-face, so AI.
John, biggest issue where innovation could actually possibly solve the problem.
Cost is the biggest issue, period. And lowering costs without screwing things up is specifically what we have to do. Only 20% of the cost of higher ed is faculty teaching, right? It's the other 80% is what we have to target hard and pull back from the cliff. There is a reason that enrollment is down 5 or 6 years running, and it starts at cost. It's an existential threat to higher ed.
But do we really know how not to screw it up, right? You know, I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old at home. They are only gonna, my one daughter's in kindergarten, my other daughter's in second grade. They're only gonna have one shot at second grade and one shot at kindergarten, right? So I don't want them to be, I don't want something to be tested on them that we're not quite sure of. So are we sure?
That is certainly the dilemma in education, right? No one wants your MVP tested on their kid.
Right.
So it does make innovation trickier, but the fact is that Gallup and others have found that the relationship with faculty is dispositive in terms of a lot of long-term outcomes that matter. So I would start with saying, let's not touch that, right? Let's flank, all of the flanking services is, there's tremendous waste. And again, we just have to go back 20, 30 years where higher ed was a lot less expensive to see models that actually work pretty well in a lot of ways and say, what if we change, where is cost disease really coming from and how do we cure it? And just the notion that it's not enough to say, let's stop raising the price every year. It's let's find 25% without touching the student-faculty relationship.
Gordon?
I mean, I would just pick up on this. I would argue that on this whole cost theme, the very increases that we've taken as an industry are an experiment that frankly is heightening the concern around the lack of post-graduation outcomes that align to what students say they come to college. So I'm talking primarily at an undergraduate level, but my view is absolutely cost and ultimately the ability to design and deliver to meet what students articulate their desired outcome from colleges. And in most cases, the data we look at, Boise State, they want a job, and they want a job that we all would agree was worth the time and the investment that was spent. A small percentage want to go into grad school. Those are really primarily the two outcomes. And we have this thing called technology that usually leads to lower costs, and we are not seeing that in higher ed. So the real win is a $4,000 a year, high quality undergraduate degree that does the work of a pre-World War II high school diploma effectively. Obviously, you got to scale it and move, but what it offered people for economic mobility. So to me, it's cost with a little bit of this color commentary.
So Kevin, John mentioned, 20 years ago we were able to do this at a lower cost. A lot of things have changed, of course, technology, which was we thought the dream was to lower cost, and it hasn't seemed to do that. Maybe you could comment on why not, but also the students have changed, right? And our assessment of students has changed in terms of what we define as retention and completion have become much more important. We're dealing with a much bigger student body, a much more diverse student body. So there's all these other issues that have required, as when I talk to college presidents, a whole new cadre of people usually to sustain the operation. And we have hoped, I think, in the last couple of years with technology that maybe some of those people could go away, with predictive analytics and AI and everything else. So maybe it's the next wave of technology that will save money. But you've done a lot of work on cost disease in higher education. Is John right? We were able to do this 20 years ago and something happened in the last couple of decades?
Wow, there's like 100 questions.
Sorry.
I was all ready to answer the other question. I got my turn. I was like,
Sorry. As soon as he said cost disease, I went to you.
So yeah, there's a lot in there. So I think obviously the marching of cost over time has been a huge issue, and I think that there are opportunities. There appear to be opportunities. One of those things, and I'll stay on this sort of cultural theme. One of the things that's always struck me, and Marni, you're talking about the student learner and being focused on the learner, it's not actually cultural for faculty to focus on the fact, and again, here we have to be very careful because different parts of the sectors operate differently, right? And sometimes, we all sort of focus on the most prominent in our mind. I'm guilty of that. But faculty don't generally think about the cost of the education. Like most employees in organizations should be charged up to innovate to both make it better and make it less expensive, right? That's more profitable for their firm, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying this is a criticism, but faculty, generally speaking, to overgeneralize, don't think about that. They don't keep thinking about it. And with respect to what John was saying, that the issue is not really about the student learning, we do think that there are technologies that can lower the cost of student learning. I mean, that's what we're talking about in the master's program and the $4,000, et cetera. So one of the challenges is, how do you get the most important, quote unquote, employees of the institution also engaged in that question? How do we make the education both better and less expensive? And we're starting to see faculty be more focused on that. I think the OER is a great example where you see open education resources and faculty care about what it's costing students to have to buy the textbooks and things like that. But generally speaking, that's a fairly new phenomenon where that's even anywhere on the radar. So it's definitely not going to be on the radar of faculty adjusting the way they do their work or their pedagogy to try to make it so that more students can learn at the same price. So I would put this at also not just cost but productivity.
Okay.
Because it's kind of fascinating to hear people talk about lowering enrollments at the same time we talk about all the students that are lifelong learners that need more education. I mean, there's huge demand out there if we figure out how to put it out there at the right cost and therefore the right price. So I think the last thing that I'll say on this is that from my perspective, there's these double paradoxes about innovation in higher ed. One is that generally speaking, the institutions that have the resources, whether that's dollar, faculty, capabilities, don't have the incentives to innovate. They don't have to. And those that are in that other position maybe don't have the resources to innovate as quickly. That's one of the problems. The other problem is that the students from a mission point of view who most need help with higher education are the most expensive to teach. So you get into this situation where there's a mission conflict, right? Because you want to bring in students that are less well prepared or low SES or whatever it might be, first generation. Those students are harder to teach. They're more expensive. So you get these paradoxes that work against the ability to innovate. And at the end of the day, I think on these points, innovation is actually quite boring. And we're doing a huge study right now at Ithaka on trying to roll out an adaptive learning introductory math statistics course in a bunch of institutions in Maryland. And what we're finding is that the challenges are not the technology or the platform. I mean, there's some of that, getting the technology and the platform to fit in with the infrastructure or the registrar, but the real challenges are in training of faculty, adjusting faculty pedagogy to fit the platform, having that, and that doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of the faculty or making them do things they don't want to do, but just taking the best value of the platform where it is to lower the cost, to be able to teach more students. It's those hand-to-hand combat, blocking and tackling issues on the campuses to help make that change happen is what's holding up the quote-unquote innovation and the possibility that there might be lower costs. And that's about a shared understanding of whether statistics curricula could be accepted from Montgomery College over to University of College, College Park, University of Maryland College Park. So I think innovation, when it comes to these teaching things, is very much about very boring issues of implementation on campuses in order to get to scale. And that is a huge challenge. It's enabled by technology, but it's not a thing that's solved by technology.
Okay, so we talked about innovation, we've talked about some of the problems, we've talked about how to solve the problems we're trying to solve, and we talked about some of the solutions. But now the question is, who is going to implement these solutions? So I want to talk about this theme, and then I want to open it up for some questions from the audience. So here we are at ASU GSV. A lot of the people here are kind of outside of the the traditional legacy, traditional higher education ecosystem, right? They're the outside players that increasingly have been trying to solve these problems in higher education. Faculty sometimes push back against that. Other academics sometimes push back against that. So as we think about innovation, what's the right balance of driving innovation through outside partnerships and vendor relationships, and what's the right balance between building this internally, John? So I'll start with you, because you're one of these outsiders that have been trying to, over the years, trying to build these capacities and selling them to universities. What do you think is the right balance?
You know, it's a lot of this is a lot like, you know, that first wave of schools realizing that they could probably outsource their cafeteria to save money and get better quality. That there are common sense things that universities just aren't necessarily great at, and those are easy. Everything else, it should be who can best support building internal capacity to move past. Like one of the things, you look at Amazon Go, right? And you look at Walmart's acquisition of Jet. Like the notion of retail versus online, you know, e-tailers, that's just going away. It's just you know, in higher ed, the notion of online programs and classroom programs is a transitional moment, right? So if you conceptualize what a university looks like that's agile, like who are the people who are just building out infrastructure kinds of solutions that allow a school to do that while lowering its cost? And those people probably aren't in-house right now.
Okay. Gordon, thoughts on this?
Well, I mean,
How do you balance it?
I mean, I think from our institution level, I would say that there's core competencies. I think there's also deficit areas where you may need to try to play catch up, and you're looking to build capabilities. But you know, from my standpoint, we really think a lot about this issue of interoperability, and maybe I'm coming back a little bit to Kevin because it's just stuck in my brain. Another piece of this is our inability to be interoperability. There's so much fat's the wrong word, I apologize. We have our core competencies, right? And some of our faculty work, the distinctiveness that we do. But outside of that, from my standpoint, every organization should be saying, we're up for grabs. We're thinking about how do we get creative, and that creativity could include lowering cost. It kills me. I sat with a student who was an honor student at Washington State, transferring to Boise State. And that individual shared with me they went back a year and they couldn't get a single credit hour from being in the honors college at Washington State, transferring to Boise State, because of, you know, the title was different than what we were looking at, and it drives me
So
personally
amazing
bonkers.
that we're talking about that like 10 years after we started
It's
talking
not
about
even,
it.
yeah, I mean, and I'm fearful we'll be talking about it 10 years from now. And I think that there's either maybe blending, maybe there's third-party groups that can facilitate that, but we have to be willing to relax standards. I offer a Harvard Business School credential of readiness for academic credit to undergrads, and that is not without a lot of difficult conversation, because we teach accounting at Boise State, Accounting 1, and my thinking is how do we encourage research around ag-based economy accounting in Boise, Idaho, where nobody's going to win a Nobel Prize for teaching Accounting 1, and Harvard Business School is not bad. So why not think about what that could offer? That's a real cultural challenge. So I'm a little bit off your question, but those are the things that are on my mind.
Sean, how should we balance this?
I think it depends entirely on the situation, right? The segment, the market that we're talking about. But I believe that internal capacity, I think John used that term, is crucially valuable. And it's going to be complementary often with an outside vendor relationship. In just the general, you know, world of business, you want to outsource things that are non-core or non-critical. Things that are core and critical, like aspects of teaching or, you know, the fundamentals of the work of universities.
Right, but isn't the part of the universities that they think everything's critical?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of room
Right.
for improvement.
I mean, it's hard to define core.
Yeah,
at many
I
places,
worry
right?
that many,
especially in an environment of shared governance,
Yeah.
right? Where administration might think something's not core, but the faculty think it's core, and vice versa.
right, many institutions are not, I think, building enough internal capacity, and those that are, I think, are thriving in terms of enrollment and partnership and growth, and it's cultural, and it's really important to make that internal investment.
Marni, and then I have a comment on that.
So, speaking from my previous experience working for a large system, I really came to believe that this is a really slippery slope that we're talking about. When the future of education requires a digital infrastructure to support teaching and learning in a community of care, and that becomes the central nervous system of the university of the future, and you are subcontracting that entire thing out to for-profit providers. over time, what does that mean? I think right now, universities by and large still think of online learning and digitally supported learning as on the periphery of what they do, and so they don't mind.
They don't really care.
They don't think it's core right now, but what happens when it is core?
And by then you haven't built that internal
And by then you
capacity.
don't have that infrastructure, and you have your private dollars or your state dollars flowing to for-profit companies who own all the data, who own all the intellectual property, and who own all the know-how. That is a very interesting situation for everyone to consider. I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I think it should be considered. I think, secondly, technology that serves incumbent traditional higher ed can be as much a constraint as it is an affordance. For technology companies to sell their wares, they have to sell to the incumbent model, which is term-based and time-bound and credit hour-bound and yada, yada, yada. And they have to do that because that's what people will buy. The minute you want to do something like that within traditional education that is not any of those things, you got a problem. And you can go to them and say, hey, how can you help me with them? And they're like, well, for $15 million, we can Band-Aid a solution for your competency-based program. So I think that's true also. We see that within traditional ed, but we also see that in a model like WGU that is a large, we're a big school. We're doing very innovative things, and we're still having to deal with the Band-Aids because we are not the common model. And so for us, a lot of that, what that means is a lot of work that we do does have to be taken in-house to sort of allow us to do our job. One last thing I would say for anybody who is a vendor in the room, from my perspective, vendors like institutions need to do a lot more work that's targeted at the learner. If you create products and services for learners, for individual learners, institutions can use them in a variety of different ways. If you create products for institutions, you're going to lock us into that institutional model, and we're not going to have the flexibility that we really need to survive in the coming decade.
The other thing, and then John, I know you have a comment, and then I'm going to open it up to questions, is building this internal capacity also builds expertise within the institution. I spend a lot of time now on leadership development, and one thing that worries me is that in some universities and in some areas, whether it's information technology or whether it's financial affairs, I think this is a big issue, is that when you go, it's not very deep bench. And so when the CFO retires, or when the chief technology officer retires, there's not enough people to take those jobs, enough qualified people who have that internal capacity. And so I think that not only are you not building the internal capacity, you're not building the internal human capital that's going to be necessary to sustain these universities for the next 100 years. With that comment, I'll turn over to John, and then we're going to open it up to questions.
I just want to give one example of like just obvious cost savings through what might be considered innovation or just common sense. Most residential colleges, their revenue in the summer is 1/10 of their revenue in the spring or fall. And these are campuses that absolutely could be running 3 semesters and offering students in exchange for a 20% reduction in tuition. Why don't you take the first year, spring and fall on campus, and then 2 additional springs, 2 additional falls, and use the summer, use semester abroad, use semester online, do other things so that we can use this physical plant for another 25% of students. And if you look at the cost structure of schools, again, without impairing student-faculty engagement, there's an awful lot of really simple things to do to start driving costs down.
Let's open it up. We have about 15 minutes or so left in the panel. I still have a slew of questions, but I want to try to get to some of the questions that we may have in the audience. Yes, in the back.
So thank you all. As the Chief Academic Officer of the University of Washington's expansion campus, committed to access for underserved students, I get what you're talking about, but I want to say, and I criticize faculty all the time, but today I'm going to defend faculty. Faculty do care about costs, they do care about students and saving dollars, and they do care about those issues, but what they also care about is that it looks like so often the conversations are structured around the cost of them compared
Anybody want to talk about data privacy?
That's an interesting one.
Can I ask a question for you? Why do you care about data privacy? What is the data you have? Obviously not credit card, Social Security. Why do you care? What is the data that we're all working so hard to protect? Who cares about, I don't know, you got to be in some course. Like what's the part that I'm just missing that makes data privacy as big an issue as it is? Because it gets in the way all the time of significant synergies among schools and among faculty members.
So I think really quickly, the distinction is, because our students share their information all the time, every day, to a whole lot of people, but it's them making that decision. I think the distinction is our students do not want us to be sharing their data without their consent, without their engagement, without their decision making. And that's, I think, a role that you don't want to put universities in.
Yes, in the back. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, never.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think what I also heard you say is the students need to own that data, and that is the student records issue of our time. Students need to own their own data and be able to share it across institutions and not feel like it's only our university's right to share that data, usually with a $15 to $25 transcript fee.
Yeah, there's a second dimension to the data question, and that is not just the student data privacy, it's that who owns the student data in terms of transactions with the LMS, transactions with adaptive learning platforms and others. What I continue to hear from a number of campuses that are engaged in these agreements is we can't get our data back in terms of being in control of our own analytic initiatives. If we sign a privacy contract with a third party, they do it, but we can't get it. And you're going to.
Well, you can buy. One day you might be able to buy it back, probably.
Right, and so you know, it's not just Facebook that has this issue of who's got my data and getting it back. You're going to see a rising movement over the next 12 months of campuses saying, give us back our data. And this is not a FERPA issue.
Right.
This is an institutional service issue in terms of who controls the analytic conversation and the analytic activity.
So, Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot because this is something that's come up before around data, and some of the comparisons have been made to intellectual property and journal articles that have been written, essentially that then were sold back to campuses, and now one of the biggest costs of libraries are journal subscriptions, right? So this idea that we have this is our faculty, our intellectual property, and now we're essentially having to buy it back. That's the comparison that's made to data.
Yeah, so I think absolutely that institutions should have their own data, right? So that's the notion that you could enter into a contract and the provider would get the data and you would not get it back. That seems just like that should be unacceptable. There's no question about that. That should be
Unfortunately, it's common practice.
So I think that's something that people have to just say no, as it were. The other part of that, though, which is really problematic, which you identified, is this issue between institutional and cross-institutional issues. So even if you get your data back at institution X, that's not enough, right? So the data are valuable in the aggregate, right? And when you get lots and lots of data. So one of the challenges is that goes back to where the privacy issues are going to be challenging, is that they're going to prevent, let's just say, a group of consortia of institutions
To share.
sharing the data to get the aggregation, to be able to get the learning that comes from the data, that comes from this aggregation. So, whether that's outsourced to a private firm or not, it's the aggregation of the data that is going to be where the power of the data are, right? So I think that's a big challenge, and this gets just to come back to your question.
Right.
I remember I've been working in this territory for a long time, and I remember reading back in the early 90s about this problem with people selling, the whole, commercial publisher issue. And I remember thinking very naively at that time, like, well, that's absolutely crazy, right? Where faculty give away their IP and then they have to buy it back. But I remember thinking at the time, like, it's so crazy there must be a good reason. And I think the good reason is there's no alternative. So I think that's the thing that we really have to think about. It's all well and good to say, well, we don't want to outsource this to the commercial providers.
But what are you going to do otherwise, right?
The advantage they have is they can aggregate across the overall problem, right? And it's a problem that's bigger than an individual institution can solve.
Right.
So we try to do some things with open source and collaborative efforts, but they're kind of kumbaya efforts that don't really create like products that actually deliver the value. And that's where it's very hard to compete with the commercial entities that provide those types of things. So I think when we talk about those things, we have to think about how do we create the alternative, whether it's how do we aggregate the data in order to be able to use it, and what are our privacy issues? Because I think, John, you're highlighting a really key point, which is that the concerns about privacy and the GCs, et cetera, are going to potentially make it very difficult for institutions to use data to improve learning. And that the improved learning will happen on the aggregated platforms instead of in the core area of your mission. So somehow, how do you address those issues of data sharing in a safe way across like-minded institutions to get that value? It's a hard problem.
And how do you get from that data and access to that data to real learning about what works and what doesn't work for individual students? Most universities do not have that infrastructure, that human capital, and that capability to rally around those insights and turn them into change. And further, most institutions don't have a structure that would require anybody to respond to those, that would incent anybody to respond to changes that are coming out of that data.
Question here in the second
row.
row.
Saying is why
Yeah.
the other guys.
Follow up on that, we're talking a lot about capacity issues here and infrastructure issues, which I think is one critical part and barrier to our institutional learning, but there's another piece that perhaps John was getting at when it comes to the cultural piece. Institutions are supposed to be learning organizations, but we have a high performance culture that makes us scared to innovate. How have you bridged that gap culturally?
In other words, they're afraid to fail.
Exactly.
I think I would say one thing that I just really love about WGU, and I haven't been there that long, but the thing that struck me right away is that this data that we have access to, and we don't have access to it all, and we struggle with the same issues that the gentleman in the back of the room was talking about, but we huddle as an organization around our student progress and performance data every 2 weeks, and then every month, and then quarterly. And the insights that are coming out of that in real time are getting taken right back, not just into the surrounding services, but into the curriculum itself. And that is a capacity that I think that's core to our mission, but it's not hard to do. It's just you have to have the will to do it and the structures to do it. And when you do it, it's amazing the kind of learning that's coming out of that in real time. It drives culture.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing I would.
And then I have a one or two wrap-up questions.
The thing I would just say is that I think for incumbents, for established universities, thinking about the structure that you design that can allow for the permission to experiment. I'm here as a voice of one of those. I think it's an N of one on the higher ed landscape, a diploma-granting college that's not organized around an academic discipline, but rather is focused on serving as a catalytic engine. So I've created a major that pedagogically blends art, psychology, and computer science to do industry-focused AR/VR, but we're also looking and talking to partners about how do we bake into your health insurance access to subscription-based education that delivers a $25,000 bachelor's degree. So that latitude that can come in an experimental compartment that allows parts of your university to continue to operate, and then we export those that actually succeed. So they're not meant to just grow a fiefdom, rather serve as that permission without having to disrupt the current work of the day.
And then,
Two quick things on that. First, we've worked with schools in the past that just hated data. Like you'd come back to them and the answer is we just stop working with them. Like to some degree, you find the people who are interested and then you drive change, and the schools that drive change, you know, everybody else is just going to watch. They're either going to eventually join in or they're going to have a problem. And the second thing, just to throw it out there, innovation without scale, not immediately, but soon, is quaint. But
And we're good at that.
We're
at
very
small
good at
scale.
that.
The incumbents are.
yes, I always love going to campuses, and they always want to show you their most innovative program, and they take you to the corner
5 students.
campus, and it's like 5 students in it. Okay, so let's, it's that proverbial final question that we tend to have a lot here at ASU GSV. Let's imagine the future. We're back here on the 20th anniversary of ASU GSV. It's 10,000 people. and who knows how many different speakers. But what if the current trends continue? What is going to be the big topic of conversation at that 20th anniversary? What is higher education going to look like? We're going to come right down the line. I'm going to put Sean on the spot and let him start.
Mergers and acquisitions. I think we're going to see, yes, some colleges will close, but I think perhaps more of them, nonprofit small colleges and other colleges, are going to need to merge into larger entities. It's already
You're seeing a lot of that in your hometown of Boston.
Yeah, in Boston, we've had 4 mergers or closures in the last, since 2016. And we still have 80 institutions left, and there'll be fewer nationally. And I think it's going to mirror, and there are positive ways to do this, but there are a lot of challenges, and it's not something where higher ed has had to have this capability. What we saw in the 80s and 90s with health systems and all kinds of thorny issues. But today you have big health systems that have regional and small specialty hospitals operating within them. I think we'll probably be talking about that in 12 or 13 years.
Gordon.
If I had to look forward 10 years, to me, I think we're headed in a direction where there's going to be some folks who solve the issue of a very low-cost annual tuition, primarily technology delivered that delivers employability, and individuals who choose a more premium experience that's almost exclusively back on campus, that's considered a luxury, kind of a la pre-World War II, and until somebody figures that out, that's my view of where we're headed.
Kevin?
I think I'm a little bit more on the M&A side. I think that there's a good chance that one of our highly well-branded institutions decides that they can really accommodate 200,000 students, and you have a distributed network of places where people go under one brand to get education. I think that could happen, and that sort of mirrors the healthcare area, and I think that would be something that would give scale to some of the issues that we were talking about earlier.
Marni?
I think in 20 years, higher education will be an open loop system. I think we'll see the divides between high school and undergraduate and graduate and continuing and professional education dissolve. Students will have a universal transcript where they own their data, and they will pick and choose from both institutions and other types of learning experiences to build their brand for the knowledge economy. I think institutions will increasingly be about validating those accomplishments, and I think there are going to be way more players in that system than there are today.
And finally, our Lifetime Achievement Award winner. Sorry, I've been told I have to say this like 5 times today. So, John.
Agree totally that there will be 2,000 institutions. The consolidation.
2,000 left.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
That the consolidation that tech happens, actually, you could both be right. There are increasing consolidation and then lots of little things, in the way that there still are lots of little bookstores springing up, but the great majority is in very few hands. And I think you're going to see higher ed as a service. That past your undergraduate experience, an ongoing relationship at $1,000, $2,000 a year to continue to allow you to navigate an increasingly complex, changing job market.
Consolidation is interesting. I think it's incredibly hard to do this. When Sweetbriar tried to close, the governor and there's a little 800-person college. The alumni went up in arms. They raised all this money. The governor and the attorney general got involved. So, it's pretty tough to do that. But I think I'm going to write about this with all your predictions, and we're going to hold your feet to the fire when we come back here for the 20th anniversary of ASU GSV. Please join me in thanking this great panel. Thank you.